The iron collar weighed 7 pounds and bore the maker's mark. Richmond Foundry, 1849. When federal marshals cut it from the neck of a woman found wandering the Kentucky hills in October of 1854, the metal had worn grooves into her collarbone deep enough to hold rainwater. She wouldn't speak. Couldn't, the doctor said, examining throat scars that suggested someone had tried to silence her permanently. But she carried something the marshals hadn't expected: a leather satchel containing 43 iron collars, each engraved with initials and dates, each belonging to someone who had disappeared along the Ohio River corridor between 1848 and 1854. The woman died 3 days later without uttering a word. The collars were catalogued as evidence in a case that would never go to trial, and the man who had forged them, worn them, profited from them, had already been dead for 2 weeks. His name was Nathaniel Clark. The auction notice in the Charleston Mercury for April 7, 1848, listed Nathaniel Clark's services under specialized recovery and return. The advertisement was small, tucked between notices for cotton brokerage and ship chandlery, but specific in its language. Negro property recovered regardless of distance or difficulty. Compensation negotiable. Discretion guaranteed. No recovery, no fee. The address given was a boarding house on Meeting Street that no longer exists, torn down in 1892 to make way for a bank. Clark was 31 years old when he placed that advertisement, born in Lynchburg, Virginia, in 1817, the son of a tobacco warehouse foreman who drank himself to death before Nathaniel turned 12. His mother remarried quickly to a man who ran a slave hiring agency, leasing enslaved workers to plantation owners who needed seasonal labor but couldn't afford permanent purchases. Young Nathaniel grew up watching human beings appraised like livestock, seeing how the system transformed people into ledger entries, into quarterly earnings, into assets that could be tracked, recovered, and resold. By 1845, Clark had worked as an overseer on 3 different plantations in Virginia and North Carolina. Each position ended the same way, with complaints about his methods. Not that he was cruel, exactly. The plantation owners of the 1840s tolerated brutality as standard practice. What bothered them was Clark's efficiency, his systematic approach, the way he treated escape attempts not as moral failures, but as engineering problems requiring better solutions. One plantation owner wrote in a letter preserved in the North Carolina State Archives that Clark lacks the temperament for direct management, but possesses unusual aptitude for tracking and recovery work. The man understood his own talents. By 1848, Clark had transitioned fully into bounty hunting, specializing in recovering people who had escaped bondage and made it across state lines. The work paid well, very well. A typical fee ranged from $50 to $200 per recovery, depending on distance and difficulty. In a year when skilled craftsmen earned perhaps $300 annually, Clark was pulling in $2,000 or more. The business model was straightforward. Plantation owners, merchants, widows with inherited human property, they would contact Clark with descriptions and last known locations. He would investigate, gather intelligence, plan his approach, then execute the recovery. Sometimes this meant tracking people through swamps and pine forests. Sometimes it meant bribing ferry operators or innkeepers. Sometimes it meant posing as an abolitionist to infiltrate the networks helping people escape. Clark kept meticulous records. A ledger discovered in his personal effects after his death, now housed in the Kentucky Historical Society, documents 173 successful recoveries between April of 1848 and August of 1854. Each entry includes a name, physical description, date of escape, date of recovery, location captured, and fee collected. The handwriting is neat, unhurried, the entries organized with the precision of a bookkeeper. But numbers obscure the human cost. The Ohio River formed a border that existed on maps and in law, but dissolved in practice. The North Bank meant free states: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. The South Bank meant Kentucky, Virginia, slave states where human bondage was woven into every economic transaction, every property deed, every inheritance. The river itself was perhaps 1,000 feet wide in most places, narrow enough that on quiet nights you could hear dogs barking from the opposite shore. Between 1848 and 1854, Nathaniel Clark operated primarily in the borderlands: northern Kentucky, southern Ohio, western Virginia, the mountainous regions where state lines tangled and legal jurisdiction blurred. These were territories where federal fugitive slave laws granted bounty hunters extraordinary powers, but offered little practical enforcement support. A man like Clark was essentially a privateer operating under legal cover, empowered by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 to cross state boundaries, detain suspected runaways without warrants, and compel local citizens to assist in captures under penalty of fine. The system was designed to terrorize. Clark understood this intuitively. His methods relied not just on tracking skill, but on cultivating networks of informants: ferry operators who noted unusual crossings, shopkeepers who reported strangers purchasing traveling supplies, ministers who quietly passed along information from their congregations. He paid well for intelligence. A boarding house owner in Cincinnati named Margaret Hewitt received $5 each time she reported a newly arrived black family to Clark's attention. Her ledger, discovered during an 1855 probate case, documents 17 such reports. The fear extended beyond the people Clark actually pursued. His presence in a region created ripples of panic. Free black families with legitimate papers would flee their homes when word spread that a bounty hunter was working the area. Churches would cancel evening services. Settlement houses would lock their doors. The mere possibility of Nathaniel Clark investigating your background, questioning your free papers, dragging you before a commissioner appointed under the Fugitive Slave Act was enough to disrupt entire communities. And Clark cultivated that fear deliberately. In July of 1850, a notice appeared in the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer warning, "All persons of color without incontrovertible proof of free status, that a recovery agent would be conducting inquiries in the Ohio Valley throughout the summer months." The notice didn't name Clark, but everyone knew. Free black residents of Wheeling, including families who had lived there for generations, packed belongings and fled to Pittsburgh or further north into Pennsylvania. The notice was a bluff. Clark never came to Wheeling that summer, but the panic served his purposes. The more people ran, the more the system assumed they had something to hide. The more communities fractured under suspicion, the easier it became for men like Clark to operate. Fear did half his work for him. 1851 began with ice thick enough on the Ohio River that people crossed on foot between Kentucky and Ohio near the town of Ripley. The river, frozen solid for the first time in 12 years, created a temporary bridge that dozens of enslaved families used to reach free territory. Among them were Isaac and Sarah Colton, ages 34 and 29, with 3 children. Daniel, age 9, Rebecca, age 6, and an infant son named Thomas. The Coltons had been enslaved on a tobacco plantation near Maysville, Kentucky, owned by a man named James Rutherford. On January 16, 1851, they walked across the frozen river in darkness, carrying the baby wrapped in blankets. holding the older children's hands. They reached the Ohio side near dawn and were met by members of the Presbyterian Church in Ripley, who operated what was then called a station on the Underground Railroad network. For 3 weeks, the Coltons sheltered in a series of safe houses moving northeast through Ohio toward Pennsylvania. They were given clothing, food, forged free papers. They traveled by wagon at night, hidden under hay or in false bottom compartments. The network was careful, experienced. By early February, the family had reached a Quaker settlement outside of Zanesville, Ohio, more than 100 miles from the river crossing. They thought they were safe. James Rutherford had posted a $200 reward for the family's return and hired Nathaniel Clark within 48 hours of discovering they had fled. Clark began his investigation at the river crossing, interviewed ferry operators and residents of Ripley, learned about the church network, and started mapping the most likely routes north. He worked methodically, visiting every settlement and safe house rumored to shelter runaways, asking questions, offering money for information. In Zanesville, a shopkeeper named William Morris sold supplies to the Quaker settlement and occasionally saw unfamiliar black families passing through. When Clark arrived asking questions and offering $20 for useful intelligence, Morris described a family matching the Coltons' description. He mentioned that they attended Sabbath services at the Friends Meeting House. He mentioned that they planned to travel further north to Cleveland once the spring thaw made river travel safer. Clark waited until the following Sunday. He attended the Quaker service, sitting in the back, observing. He identified the Colton family by their children's ages. After the service ended, he approached Isaac Colton outside, showed him a warrant issued by a federal commissioner in Kentucky, and placed iron shackles on his wrists before anyone could react. The Quakers protested. Several men tried to physically intervene. Clark drew a pistol and explained calmly that anyone who interfered with a federal warrant would face criminal charges and $1,000 fines under the Fugitive Slave Act. He was operating within the law. Local law enforcement, even in free Ohio, was required to assist him. The Coltons were held overnight in the Zanesville jail while Clark arranged transport back to Kentucky. Sarah Colton begged the guards to let her keep the infant with her, but Clark insisted all 3 children be separated and secured individually to prevent escape attempts during the journey. The 9-year-old boy, Daniel, was placed in a cell alone. He didn't cry, he didn't speak, he just stared at the wall. By February 12th, the entire family was back at the Maysville plantation. Rutherford had them whipped publicly as an example. Isaac received 30 lashes. Sarah received 20. The children were forced to watch. Then Rutherford made a business decision. He sold the entire family separately to different buyers across 3 states. Isaac went to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. Sarah to a household in Mobile, Alabama. The children scattered to locations their parents would never learn. The family never saw each other again. Clark collected his $200 and noted the recovery in his ledger with characteristic brevity. Colton family, 5 individuals, Zanesville, Ohio, Feb 11, 1851. Transport 6 days. Fee $200. The iron collar weighed 7 pounds and closed with a bolt mechanism that required a specialized key. Clark commissioned the first batch from Richmond Foundry in 1849, paying extra for a locking system that couldn't be picked or broken without tools. Each collar bore the foundry mark and a unique identification number. Clark maintained a corresponding ledger noting which collar had been used on which individual during transport. The collars served multiple purposes. They prevented escape by making it impossible to move quietly through underbrush or swim across rivers. The weight created constant physical exhaustion, and they marked the wearer as property in transit, allowing Clark to move freely through towns and checkpoints without constant challenges to his authority. A person in an iron collar was visibly under restraint, visibly someone's property being recovered, visibly not a free person traveling by choice. But the collars were just one component of Clark's system. He developed an entire methodology for long-distance transport of captured people. For journeys exceeding 3 days, he used modified wagons with reinforced beds and iron rings bolted to the frame for securing chains. He employed drivers and assistants, paying them daily wages plus bonuses for successful deliveries without escapes. He established supply caches along frequently traveled routes, dried food, rope, spare shackles, ammunition, hidden in barns and outbuildings owned by sympathetic property owners who received small monthly payments for the privilege. The most disturbing aspect of Clark's operation was its efficiency. He treated human transport as a logistics challenge, constantly refining his methods based on experience. After 2 individuals managed to slip their shackles during an 1849 transport, Clark redesigned his restraint system with backup chains and redundant locks. After another escaped by dislocating his own thumb to slide free from handcuffs, Clark switched to wrist cuffs that enclosed the entire forearm. He kept detailed notes on everything: which routes offered the best cover from prying eyes, which innkeepers could be trusted to provide overnight holding cells, which ferry operators would transport shackled individuals without asking questions. These notes, preserved in fragments across multiple archives, read like a dark mirror of the Underground Railroad guides abolitionists used to help people escape. Where those guides identified safe houses and sympathetic allies, Clark's notes identified capture points and collaborators willing to profit from human suffering. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had transformed the legal landscape in Clark's favor. The law required federal marshals to assist in capturing suspected runaways and imposed penalties on anyone who harbored or aided escapees. But more than that, it allowed special commissioners to rule on the status of accused runaways based solely on an affidavit from the claimed owner. No trial, no jury, no opportunity for the accused to testify. The commissioner received $5 if he ruled the person was free, $10 if he ruled they were enslaved and should be returned. The financial incentive was explicitly built into the law. Clark understood how to exploit every aspect of this system. He cultivated relationships with commissioners who consistently ruled in favor of slaveholders. He learned which magistrates could be swayed with gifts or favors. He developed form documents, pre-written affidavits and warrants that could be quickly customized with names and descriptions. The paperwork itself became a weapon. Margaret Hewitt ran a boarding house in Cincinnati at the corner of 5th and Vine Streets. 3 stories, 12 rooms, catering primarily to commercial travelers and families in transition. She was a widow, 53 years old in 1852, supporting herself and 2 grown daughters through the boarding house income. She attended Methodist services every Sunday. She was known in her neighborhood as respectable, if not particularly warm. She was also one of Nathaniel Clark's most reliable informants. The relationship began in August of 1849, when a black family took lodging at Hewitt's boarding house for 3 nights while arranging passage to Cleveland. The man presented free papers that looked authentic, notarized documents from a Virginia county clerk declaring him and his family legally free. But something about the papers bothered Hewitt. The notary seal looked freshly inked. The signatures seemed practiced rather than natural. She sent a note to Clark, whose business card she had received weeks earlier when he canvassed Cincinnati boarding houses looking for informants. Clark arrived the next morning, examined the free papers, and determined they were indeed forgeries. He arrested the family, held them under federal warrant, and eventually returned them to a plantation in North Carolina. He paid Hewitt $5 for the intelligence. That transaction established a pattern that would repeat dozens of times over the next 5 years. Hewitt would observe her guests, note details, and report anything suspicious to Clark. The $5 payments added up. Over the course of 1850 to 1854, Hewitt earned at least $85 from these reports, roughly a quarter of her annual income from the boarding house. But Hewitt was just one node in a much larger network of collaborators who made Clark's operation possible. In every town Clark worked, he cultivated similar relationships: ferry operators who watched river crossings, shopkeepers who noted unusual purchases, sturdy traveling shoes, men's clothing purchased by women, bulk food supplies bought by people who appeared to have no fixed residence, stable hands who remembered late-night departures, even ministers who quietly reported members of their congregations suspected of harboring runaways. These collaborators weren't monsters. They were ordinary people making small compromises, accepting modest payments, telling themselves they were simply following the law. The Fugitive Slave Act made what they did legal. Federal authority gave them permission. And the money, $5 here, $10 there, made it easier to ignore the human consequences. The most extensive documentation of this network comes from a ledger Clark maintained, listing his regular informants by city and the amounts paid to each. The ledger, discovered in a trunk of his personal effects, names 47 individuals across 7 states who provided intelligence between 1848 and 1854. Most entries are cryptic: initials, locations, payment amounts, brief notes about the quality of information provided. But enough names are spelled out fully that historians have been able to identify many of Clark's collaborators. They included a Presbyterian minister in Wheeling who reported 2 families suspected of being runaways in 1851, a postal clerk in Portsmouth, Ohio, who alerted Clark when individuals received mail from known abolitionist sympathizers, a tavern owner in Maysville, Kentucky, who kept a guest register noting the race and status of everyone who stayed overnight. These were people integrated into their communities, respected by their neighbors, living ordinary lives while participating in extraordinary evil. The complicity extended beyond individuals to institutions. Banks in border states held accounts for bounty hunters and processed the fees paid for successful recoveries. Courts appointed commissioners who rubber-stamped arrest warrants. Newspapers published advertisements offering rewards for escaped individuals, often including detailed physical descriptions that read like livestock sale notices. Churches, not all, but enough, remained silent or actively supported the system through sermons emphasizing biblical passages about servants obeying masters. What would you do if your neighbor was harboring a family fleeing bondage and a well-dressed stranger appeared at your door offering $5 for information? Would you take the money? Would you refuse? Would you warn your neighbor or protect your own position in the community? These weren't abstract moral questions in 1850. They were daily decisions that ordinary people made, and the accumulation of those decisions, small compromises, modest betrayals, convenient silences, sustained the entire apparatus of human hunting. In December of 1852, a woman named Hannah Marley arrived in Zanesville, Ohio, traveling with her 2 daughters, ages 12 and 8. She presented free papers declaring that she and her children had been manumitted by their former owner in Virginia upon his death. The papers appeared legitimate. Proper seals, clear signatures, dated 3 months prior. She rented a small house on the edge of town, found work as a seamstress, and enrolled her daughters in the local school for black children. She had been free for exactly 4 months when Nathaniel Clark arrived asking questions. The story of Hannah Marley illustrates the particular terror that free black families faced in the years following the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. Even with legitimate documentation, even in free states, families lived under constant threat that a bounty hunter might challenge their papers, drag them before a commissioner who profited from rulings that declared them enslaved, and send them into bondage regardless of truth. Clark's interest in Hannah Marley began with a letter from a lawyer in Richmond, Virginia, representing the estate of the man who had supposedly freed her. The lawyer claimed the manumission documents were fraudulent, that the deceased man's signature had been forged, and that Hannah and her daughters remained legal property of the estate. He hired Clark to locate and return them, offering $150 for all 3. When Clark appeared at Hannah Marley's door on the morning of December 14, 1852, she showed him her free papers immediately. He examined them carefully and declared them forgeries. The notary seal was the wrong style for the county clerk's office. The handwriting didn't match known examples of the deceased man's signature. The paper stock was too recent. Hannah protested that the papers had been prepared by a lawyer in Richmond, that they had been properly registered with county authorities. Clark was unmoved. He had a warrant from a federal commissioner in Kentucky. Local law required cooperation. Hannah's neighbors watched from windows as Clark placed her and her daughters in a wagon and transported them to the Zanesville jail. Several white families who knew Hannah from church wrote letters to the mayor protesting her arrest. The mayor wrote back explaining that his hands were tied. Federal law superseded local authority, and interfering with a federal warrant carried severe penalties. Hannah Marley spent 3 weeks in jail while her case was adjudicated. Her daughters were held in a separate cell. During this time, Hannah managed to send a message to the abolitionist lawyer Salmon P. Chase in Cincinnati, who agreed to represent her without fee. Chase traveled to Zanesville, examined the free papers, and argued before a federal commissioner that the documents were authentic and that the Richmond lawyer's claim was based on false testimony. The commissioner ruled against Hannah, not because the evidence favored Clark's case. By any objective standard, Hannah's free papers were legitimate, but because the commissioner received $10 for ruling her enslaved versus $5 for ruling her free. The financial incentive was decisive. On January 7, 1853, Hannah Marley and her daughters were transported back to Virginia and sold at auction to settle the estate's debts. The auction notice described them as valuable property, skilled seamstress with 2 healthy girls. They brought $800. Chase wrote about the case in a letter to fellow abolitionists, describing it as emblematic of how the Fugitive Slave Act had created a system where truth, justice, and documented freedom are subordinate to profit and procedural tyranny. The letter circulated widely in anti-slavery circles, but did nothing to help Hannah Marley, who disappeared into bondage with her daughters, their fates unknown. Clark collected his $150 and recorded the recovery in his ledger. H. Marley and 2 daughters. Zanesville to Richmond, Jan 7, 1853. Fee $150. Clark's financial records reveal the economics of human hunting with brutal clarity. Between April of 1848 and August of 1854, he earned $14,300 from recovery fees. That's roughly $100,000 in today's currency, earned by tracking and recapturing people fleeing bondage. But the ledger contains more than numbers. It documents a systematic operation with multiple revenue streams. Beyond basic recovery fees, Clark charged clients for transport costs, 50 cents per mile for wagon travel, $1 per day for secure overnight holding, $25 per week for extended pursuit requiring river or rail travel. He billed for supplies, rope, chains, collars, food for captured individuals during transport. He even charged consultation fees for investigating suspected runaways who turned out to have legitimate free papers. The ledger also reveals Clark's working relationships with other bounty hunters. He occasionally partnered on difficult cases, splitting fees with associates who had specialized knowledge or local contacts. In June of 1851, he paid a Kentucky hunter named William Graves $40 for intelligence that led to the capture of 3 men who had escaped from a Louisville tobacco warehouse. In September of 1852, he split a $200 fee with a tracker named Jonas Pettigrew, who helped locate a family that had reached Pennsylvania. These partnerships created a professional network of human hunters who shared information, techniques, and resources. They met at taverns in border towns, exchanged notes on reliable informants and cooperative law enforcement officials, warned each other about abolitionist lawyers who made captures difficult. They formed a sort of guild, an informal association of men who profited from others' desperation. The financial records also document bribes, though Clark was careful with his language. Entries like fee to P. Simmons for administrative assistance, $15, or payment to J. Carter for expedited processing, $20, clearly represent money paid to officials to speed paperwork or influence decisions. Clark understood that the system ran on incentives and that well-placed payments ensured cooperation. But perhaps most disturbing are the entries documenting Clark's growing wealth over time. In 1848, his first full year as a professional bounty hunter, he earned $600. By 1850, that figure had more than tripled to $2,100. In 1853, his most successful year, he earned $3,200, an extraordinary income for the period, placing him in the upper economic tier of Southern white society. He invested this money carefully. He purchased land in Kentucky, 240 acres near Lexington that he rented to tenant farmers. He bought shares in a Louisville bank and a Richmond textile mill. He acquired a house in Charleston large enough to require servants. By 1854, Nathaniel Clark owned property worth approximately $12,000, all of it financed by his work terrorizing black families. The wealth insulated him from consequences. When abolitionists in Ohio filed complaints accusing him of kidnapping free black citizens, he hired expensive lawyers who buried the cases in procedural motions. When a minister in Wheeling published a pamphlet condemning his methods, Clark sued for libel and won a settlement that forced the minister to print a retraction. Money bought protection, influence, and respectability. 17 years old. That's how old Moses Freeman was when Nathaniel Clark captured him outside of Cincinnati in March of 1853. The story of Moses Freeman would become central to understanding how Clark's career finally ended, though no one recognized the significance at the time. Moses had been born enslaved on a plantation near Lexington, Kentucky. His mother died when he was 8. His father had been sold away before Moses was born. He was raised by his grandmother in the plantation quarters until he turned 14, when he was put to work in the tobacco fields. He was strong, intelligent, and quiet, the kind of young man who drew attention from overseers who valued productivity and feared independence. In February of 1853, Moses made his decision. He stole away during a night with no moon, traveled on foot through Kentucky hill country, and crossed the frozen Ohio River near Maysville. He walked for 3 nights, hiding during daylight hours, eating roots and whatever he could forage. He reached Cincinnati exhausted, frostbitten, but alive. A black church in the city's Bucktown neighborhood took him in. They gave him food, clothing, and shelter while arranging the next stage of his journey. The plan was for Moses to travel by wagon to Sandusky, then by boat across Lake Erie to Canada. Freedom was perhaps 2 weeks away. Nathaniel Clark arrived in Cincinnati on routine business, collecting payment for a recent recovery and meeting with his informant, Margaret Hewitt. Hewitt mentioned that the church in Bucktown had been particularly active recently, with several young men passing through. She provided names and descriptions. One matched the description of Moses Freeman from a reward notice Clark had seen posted in Lexington 2 weeks prior. Clark waited outside the church on Sunday morning. When services ended and the congregation dispersed, he identified Moses by age and the distinctive burn scar on his left hand mentioned in the reward notice. Clark approached with 2 hired assistants, showed a federal warrant, and placed Moses under arrest before anyone could react. Moses didn't resist. He didn't run. He looked at the people around him, church members who had fed him, sheltered him, protected him, and saw their faces fall in helpless recognition that there was nothing they could do. The law was on Clark's side. Federal authority trumped local sympathy. Moses allowed himself to be shackled and led away without a word. But one witness remembered what happened next with disturbing clarity. A woman named Sarah Collins, who had sheltered Moses in her home for 3 nights, later testified that as Clark's wagon pulled away, Moses turned and looked directly at her. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His expression communicated everything: resignation, betrayal, rage carefully controlled, because any display of anger would justify worse treatment. Sarah Collins never forgot that look. She told her children about it. Her grandchildren remembered the story. And years later, when investigators tried to piece together the final weeks of Nathaniel Clark's life, that moment outside the Bucktown church became important. Moses Freeman was transported back to Kentucky, returned to the plantation, and punished severely for his escape attempt. 30 lashes, ankle shackles he would wear for 6 months. But he survived, and survival for Moses meant waiting for opportunity. By 1854, cracks were appearing in the apparatus that had protected men like Nathaniel Clark. The political landscape was fracturing along sectional lines. The Kansas-Nebraska Act had just passed, opening new territories to slavery and igniting violence in Kansas Territory between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. Northern states were increasingly resistant to federal fugitive slave enforcement. Several state legislatures had passed personal liberty laws attempting to prevent local law enforcement from cooperating with bounty hunters. Public sentiment was shifting, slowly but measurably. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin had been published in 1852 and sold 300,000 copies in its first year, making the human cost of slavery vivid to Northern readers, who had previously viewed it as an abstract political question. Anti-slavery societies were growing more organized, more militant, more willing to interfere with captures through legal challenges and, occasionally, direct action. Clark felt the change. In May of 1854, he attempted to arrest a family in Cleveland, but was met by a crowd of over 100 people who surrounded his wagon and refused to disperse. Local law enforcement claimed they couldn't guarantee his safety. Clark was forced to release the family and leave the city empty-handed. It was the first time in 6 years he had failed to complete a recovery once he had located the target. Similar incidents followed. In Columbus, Ohio, a lawyer filed a habeas corpus petition so quickly that Clark had to spend 3 days in legal proceedings before he could transport his prisoner out of state. In Wheeling, a group of black men physically confronted him on a street corner, backing down only when Clark drew his pistol. The confrontation drew a crowd, and the local sheriff suggested Clark might want to conduct his business elsewhere to avoid disturbances. The resistance wasn't universal. Most communities still cooperated. Most officials still honored federal warrants. But the certainty was eroding. The assumption that Clark could move freely without challenge. He started traveling with more hired assistants. He varied his routes to avoid towns where he had previously faced problems. He grew more cautious, more paranoid. But caution couldn't protect him from the fundamental reality that his entire operation depended on a legal and social system increasingly under pressure. The Fugitive Slave Act might remain in force, but its enforcement was becoming more difficult as northern communities developed organized resistance. The networks Clark relied on, informants, cooperative officials, intimidated bystanders, were being countered by equally organized networks, helping people escape and protecting them once they reached free states. Clark documented his growing frustration in letters to clients. In June of 1854, he wrote to a Virginia plantation owner explaining why a particular recovery was taking longer than anticipated. The abolitionist element in Ohio has become emboldened to the point of open interference. What would once have required a week now demands a month, and success cannot be guaranteed. The letter reveals Clark's recognition that his business model was becoming less viable. The economics were shifting. More time per recovery meant fewer total recoveries meant lower annual income. The risks were increasing while the profits declined. And underneath the practical concerns was something else. A sense that the system that had empowered him was not permanent. That change was coming whether he adapted or not. August 12, 1854. The date matters because it marks the moment Nathaniel Clark made a critical mistake. He had been tracking a man named Solomon Henderson for 3 weeks, following leads through Kentucky and into southern Ohio. Henderson was 42 years old, enslaved on a hemp plantation near Frankfort, Kentucky. He had escaped in July, and his owner had posted a $150 reward, substantial enough to warrant Clark's full attention. Clark traced Henderson to a small settlement outside Portsmouth, Ohio, where he was sheltering with a Quaker family named Patterson. The Pattersons were known abolitionists, their farm a documented station on the Underground Railroad. They had helped perhaps 50 people reach Canada over the previous decade. Clark's approach was his standard method. He arrived with 2 hired assistants, presented a federal warrant to the local sheriff, and demanded assistance in making the arrest. The sheriff, a man named Thomas Briggs, was required by law to cooperate. But Briggs was also deeply uncomfortable with the Fugitive Slave Act and had publicly stated his opposition to it at town meetings. He complied with the minimum required by law and nothing more. The arrest occurred just after dawn. Clark and his assistants surrounded the Patterson farmhouse, blocked all exits, and entered with weapons drawn. They found Solomon Henderson in the kitchen, eating breakfast with the Patterson family. Clark placed him in iron shackles immediately. This is where the mistake happened. One of the Patterson daughters, a girl of 14 named Elizabeth, tried to physically intervene. She grabbed Clark's arm, shouting for help, trying to prevent him from securing Henderson's restraints. Clark shoved her aside, not violently, but firmly enough that she fell against the kitchen table and struck her head. The injury was minor, a small cut that bled dramatically, but required no medical attention beyond a cloth bandage. But Elizabeth Patterson was white, and Nathaniel Clark had put his hands on her in a way that could be described as assault. The distinction mattered enormously. Clark's entire operation depended on the perception that he was a legitimate law enforcement agent operating under federal authority. His use of force was acceptable when directed at black people, enslaved or free, because the system granted him that authority. But using force against a white girl, even in the context of executing a legal warrant, crossed a line that his usual protections didn't cover. Thomas Briggs, the sheriff, saw an opportunity. He filed charges against Clark for assault, arguing that Clark's actions exceeded his authority under the federal warrant and constituted a criminal act under Ohio state law. It was a clever legal maneuver. The warrant authorized Clark to arrest Solomon Henderson, but it didn't authorize him to use force against uninvolved third parties, particularly white citizens of a free state. Clark found himself in the unfamiliar position of being the one charged with a crime. He posted bail, $200, and hired a lawyer to fight the case. But the publicity was devastating. Newspapers in Portsmouth and surrounding towns covered the story, some of them sympathetically toward Clark, but others using the incident to criticize the Fugitive Slave Act and the bounty hunters it empowered. The case dragged on for weeks. While Clark was entangled in legal proceedings, he couldn't pursue other recoveries. Clients grew frustrated with delays. His income suffered, and the assault charge, even though it would ultimately be dismissed on technical grounds, damaged his reputation in the carefully maintained network of officials and informants he depended on. But more importantly, the Henderson incident made Nathaniel Clark visible in a way he had carefully avoided for 6 years. His business thrived on operating just below public attention, known to those who needed his services but not prominent enough to attract organized opposition. The assault case put his name in newspapers. It drew attention from abolitionist lawyers who started investigating his previous recoveries. It made him a target. While Clark fought the assault charges in Ohio, something else was happening behind the scenes. Someone was compiling a record of his operations, documenting his captures, tracking his network of collaborators, building a comprehensive map of his entire system. The work was being coordinated by a loose coalition of abolitionists, free black community leaders, and sympathetic lawyers across the Ohio Valley. They had grown frustrated with the legal protections that allowed bounty hunters to operate with near impunity. If they couldn't stop Clark through courts or legislation, they would expose him through documentation, creating a public record that could be used to warn communities and protect potential targets. The effort was led by a black minister in Cincinnati named Reverend James Mitchell. Mitchell's own brother had been captured by Clark in 1851 and returned to bondage despite having legitimate free papers. Mitchell had spent the past 3 years quietly gathering information about Clark's operations, collecting testimony from witnesses, corresponding with families who had lost members to Clark's recoveries. By August of 1854, Mitchell had compiled a notebook containing names, dates, locations, and detailed descriptions of more than 40 captures Clark had made. He had testimonies from people who had been held in jails during transports, statements from informants who had grown guilty about their collaboration, records from court proceedings. The notebook was far from complete, but it represented the most comprehensive documentation of a bounty hunter's operations that had ever been assembled. Mitchell's plan was to publish the information in abolitionist newspapers, transforming Clark from a shadowy operator into a publicly identified target of organized resistance. He wanted to warn communities about Clark's methods, expose his network of informants, and create enough public pressure that Clark's business became untenable. But before Mitchell could publish his findings, something unexpected happened. Someone stole the notebook from his church office. The theft occurred on August 21st, 1854, during evening services when the church was full, but Mitchell's office was unattended. The lock was picked professionally. Nothing else was taken. Not the collection money, not the silver communion set. Just Mitchell's notebook and the loose papers containing his research. Mitchell reported the theft to local police but held little hope of recovery. He knew what had happened. Someone in Clark's network, an informant, an associate, possibly Clark himself, had learned about the investigation and acted to suppress it. The information wasn't lost entirely. Mitchell had shared portions with other abolitionists, and some testimonies existed in duplicate. But the comprehensive, organized record that could have been published as an indictment of Clark's operations was gone. Or so Mitchell thought. What Mitchell didn't know was that the person who stole the notebook wasn't working for Nathaniel Clark. The thief was a young black man who had been attending services at Mitchell's church while waiting for transport arrangements to Canada. His name was Moses Freeman. Moses Freeman had been tracking Nathaniel Clark for 4 months. After being captured in Cincinnati and returned to the Kentucky plantation, Moses had been subjected to punishment and closer supervision, but he had also been assigned to work in the plantation's main house rather than the tobacco fields, a common practice for enslaved people considered flight risks, keeping them under the owner's direct observation where escape would be more difficult. The housework gave Moses access to information. He overheard conversations about Clark's business, learned about the network of bounty hunters operating across the region, discovered that the plantation owner regularly hired Clark for recoveries. And Moses began planning not escape, but something else. Revenge was too simple a word for what Moses wanted. He didn't just want to harm the man who had captured him. He wanted to dismantle the entire system, expose the collaborators, destroy the networks that made human hunting profitable. And to do that, he needed documentation, evidence, proof that could be used to prosecute or at least publicly shame everyone involved. When Moses finally escaped again in July of 1854, this time successfully reaching Cincinnati, he didn't immediately continue north to Canada. Instead, he stayed in the city, watching and waiting. He attended Reverend Mitchell's church. He heard about the investigation into Clark's operations, and when he learned about the notebook, he made a decision. Stealing Mitchell's research wasn't about suppressing it. Moses took the notebook because he intended to use it himself, to add to it, to create something more complete than Mitchell had attempted. The Reverend was gathering information for publication, for moral exposure. Moses wanted the information for direct action. He spent the next 3 weeks in Cincinnati, working odd jobs during the day and continuing Mitchell's investigation at night. He visited locations Clark had used as temporary holding cells. He interviewed people whose family members had been captured. He cross-referenced the names in Mitchell's notebook with reward notices posted in public spaces, and he added his own observations about Clark's patterns, which towns he visited most frequently, which officials cooperated most readily, where he kept supplies cached. Moses Freeman was building a hunter's guide, but for hunting the hunter. By early September, Moses had expanded Mitchell's notebook significantly. He now had detailed information about Clark's movements, his associates, his financial arrangements, his weaknesses. And Moses had made a specific plan for how to use that information. He would follow Clark on his next recovery attempt, track him as Clark had tracked so many others, wait for the right moment, and act. The moral calculation was straightforward in Moses's mind. Nathaniel Clark had made a career of destroying families, selling human beings back into bondage, profiting from terror. The system protected him. The law empowered him. No court would bring him justice, so justice would have to be delivered outside the system by someone who had nothing left to lose. Moses Freeman had no illusions about what he was planning. He knew that killing Clark would almost certainly result in his own death, either immediately or after capture and execution. But Moses had spent his entire life enslaved. He had tasted freedom for exactly 3 weeks before being dragged back into bondage. He had experienced hope and seen it destroyed by a man who viewed human suffering as a business opportunity. If Moses was going to die, he would die after doing something that mattered. Nathaniel Clark left Cincinnati on September 15, 1854, with his most recent recovery secured in the modified wagon. The captured man was named Jacob Russell, 36 years old, who had been living as a free person in Columbus for 2 years before Clark tracked him down. Russell had a wife and 3 children in Columbus, all of them legally free. Clark's warrant covered only Russell himself, not his family, but the separation was just as devastating. The transport route would take Clark southeast through Kentucky toward Virginia, where Russell's supposed owner awaited. The journey typically required 5 to 6 days, traveling primarily during daylight hours on main roads where Clark's federal authority ensured cooperation from local populations. Moses Freeman had been following Clark's movements for 3 days, staying far enough back to avoid detection, but close enough to track the wagon's progress. He traveled on foot, sleeping in barns and woods, eating sparingly from food he had stolen or purchased. He carried very little: a knife, a length of rope, the stolen notebook, and a determination that had hardened into something beyond fear. On the second day of the transport, September 16th, Clark stopped for the night at a small inn outside Maysville, Kentucky. The inn was one of his regular stops, owned by a man named Garrett Simmons, who maintained secure holding cells in his cellar for bounty hunters transporting captives. Clark paid Simmons $3 for overnight accommodations and use of the cellar cell. Jacob Russell was locked in iron shackles attached to a wall ring, given water and bread, and left under guard, while Clark and his 2 assistants ate dinner upstairs and retired to their rooms. Moses Freeman watched from the tree line behind the inn. He waited until after midnight, when the lights had been extinguished and the building had settled into silence. Then he approached carefully, testing doors and windows until he found one unlocked, a common carelessness in rural areas where crime was rare. He entered through a rear storage room and moved through the darkened building toward the cellar stairs. His plan was simple: free Jacob Russell, take Clark's keys, his papers, his money, leave Clark alive but humiliated, stripped of the tools and authority he needed to continue his business. But Moses never reached the cellar. At the base of the stairs, he encountered one of Clark's hired assistants, a man named William Greer, who had been checking on the prisoner before retiring himself. Greer saw Moses, recognized him as an intruder, and shouted in alarm. What followed happened quickly. Greer grabbed for the pistol he carried. Moses rushed him, trying to prevent the shot that would wake the entire inn. They struggled in the narrow cellar corridor, Moses' hands on Greer's wrist, the pistol barrel swinging wildly, the gun discharged, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck Greer in the abdomen. Moses ran, not out of the building. That exit was blocked by people rushing down from the upper floors, but deeper into the cellar, past the cell where Jacob Russell watched through iron bars, into a storage area at the building's rear. He found a small window, barely large enough for his frame, broke the glass with his elbow, and squeezed through into the night. Behind him, William Greer bled out on the cellar floor. It took him 11 minutes to die. Nathaniel Clark arrived in the cellar while Greer was still conscious, holding pressure on the wound, trying to understand what had happened. Greer described his attacker: young black man, medium height, strong build, moving with purpose like he knew the layout. Clark recognized the description immediately. He had captured Moses Freeman only 6 months earlier. The boy had escaped again and now had come looking for him. The realization sent a cold shock through Clark. For 6 years, he had been the hunter, the one who tracked others, the one who held all the power in every encounter. Now someone was hunting him. The pursuit lasted 5 days. Nathaniel Clark abandoned his transport of Jacob Russell, left him secured in the Maysville jail while he organized a manhunt for Moses Freeman. Clark understood that this had become personal, that Moses represented a threat not just to his business, but to his survival. He hired a dozen men, armed them, and set out to track Moses through the Kentucky hill country. They followed him through forests and across creeks, tracking his movement by asking at farms and settlements if anyone had seen a young, black man traveling alone. The trail led east into the mountains, away from main roads, into terrain where Moses apparently hoped to lose his pursuers in the wilderness. On September 21st, they cornered him at a place called Horseshoe Bend, where a creek curved sharply around a rocky outcrop. Moses had made a defensive position among the rocks, visible from a distance but difficult to approach without exposure. He was armed with a rifle he had stolen from a cabin 2 days earlier, and he had demonstrated his willingness to use it by firing warning shots that forced Clark's men to keep their distance. The standoff lasted through the afternoon. Clark shouted offers: surrender peacefully, face trial, avoid making the situation worse. Moses shouted back, his voice carrying clearly across the creek. He wanted Clark to come forward alone. He wanted to talk. He wanted to explain why he had become a hunter himself. Clark refused. He had no interest in conversation with someone he viewed as escaped property turned murderer. He wanted Moses captured or killed, the threat eliminated, his authority restored. As sunset approached, Clark ordered his men to advance from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming Moses's position through coordinated assault. The attack began just before dusk. Moses fired 6 shots, dropping 2 men with wounds that weren't fatal but put them out of the fight. But he was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. When his rifle ran empty, he drew the knife he carried and prepared for close combat. Nathaniel Clark reached him first. They fought hand-to-hand among the rocks at Horseshoe Bend. Clark with a pistol he couldn't fire without risking hitting his own men in the close quarters. Moses with his knife and the strength of someone who had nothing to lose. The fight was brutal, graceless, desperate. Moses Freeman died there. Multiple wounds. Clark would later claim self-defense, that he had no choice, that Moses had attacked him with murderous intent and forcing lethal response. No one questioned this narrative. Moses was an escaped enslaved man who had killed a white man in the commission of a felony. His death required no justification beyond those facts. But here's what the official reports didn't mention. When Clark's men searched Moses's body, they found the notebook, Mitchell's original research, plus Moses's additions. They found maps showing Clark's supply caches and regular routes. They found lists of collaborators with notes about payment amounts and the quality of intelligence each provided. They found everything someone would need to dismantle Clark's entire operation or use it for their own purposes. Clark took the notebook and burned it immediately. He told his men it was evidence of an abolitionist conspiracy, that Moses had been working with Northern radicals to interfere with lawful slave recovery operations. He swore them to secrecy about what they had found, paid them extra for their silence, and warned that discussing the notebook's contents could implicate them in criminal conspiracy. But one man in Clark's hunting party, a young tracker named Daniel Morris, who had been hired for his knowledge of Kentucky wilderness, kept a secret of his own. Before Clark burned the notebook, Morris had read several pages. He had memorized names and locations, and Morris had family connections to the abolitionist movement in Ohio. Within 2 weeks, he would share what he remembered with Reverend Mitchell in Cincinnati. That information would prove critical, though not in the way anyone expected. Nathaniel Clark returned to Charleston in early October 1854. He had survived the encounter with Moses Freeman, eliminated a threat, and maintained his reputation. But the experience had shaken him profoundly. For the first time in his career, he had been hunted. Someone had tracked him, studied his patterns, nearly killed one of his associates. The psychological impact was significant. He spent 3 weeks in Charleston, attending to business matters, collecting outstanding fees, reassuring clients that his operations would continue normally. But privately, he was reassessing. The assault charges in Ohio, the growing resistance to fugitive slave enforcement, the Mitchell investigation, Moses Freeman's vendetta, these incidents collectively suggested that his business model was becoming untenable. On October 20th, Clark left Charleston for what would be his final transport. A Virginia plantation owner had hired him to recover a family of 4 who had escaped to Pennsylvania. The fee was $300, substantial enough to justify the time and risk. Clark traveled with 3 hired assistants, including William Greer's younger brother Edward, who had insisted on joining to avenge his brother's death. They reached Pennsylvania in late October. The tracking was straightforward. The family had settled in a Quaker community outside Philadelphia, was living openly, had made no effort to hide. Clark obtained a federal warrant from a commissioner in Harrisburg and planned to execute the capture on October 27th. They never made it to Philadelphia. On the night of October 26th, while staying at an inn near Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Nathaniel Clark and his 3 assistants died. All 4 men poisoned in their evening meal. The innkeeper found them the next morning, dead in their rooms, showing symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning: violent vomiting, convulsions, organ failure. The investigation was cursory. Local authorities suspected abolitionist extremists, possibly members of the family Clark had been pursuing, though no evidence supported this theory. The innkeeper, a man named Jonas Fletcher who claimed no knowledge of abolitionists or anti-slavery activists, was questioned extensively but never charged. The serving girl who had prepared and delivered the meals had disappeared entirely, left no forwarding. Information vanished as if she had never existed. Clark's body was transported back to Charleston and buried in an unmarked grave at his own family's request. They wanted no monument that might become a target for vandalism. His estate, the land, bank shares, house, was sold to settle debts and distributed among distant relatives. The leather satchel containing 43 iron collars was catalogued as evidence in the poisoning investigation, but never used in any prosecution. The official cause of death was recorded as arsenic poisoning by unknown parties. The case was never solved, and the people who knew the truth, the innkeeper Jonas Fletcher, the missing serving girl, the Quaker family in Philadelphia, who had very quietly arranged certain precautions, kept their secrets for decades. But oral histories preserved in Philadelphia's Black community tell a different story. They speak of a woman named Hannah who worked at Fletcher's Inn for exactly 3 weeks in October of 1854. A woman who had been enslaved in Virginia until 1853, who had been freed under suspicious circumstances, who had family connections to the Quaker Underground Network. A woman who was known to have skills in herbal remedies and a particular knowledge of substances that could heal or harm depending on dosage. The oral histories mention that Hannah disappeared from Pennsylvania after Clark's death and was never seen in the region again. Some say she went to Canada. Others claim she returned south under an assumed name to help other families escape. A few whisper that she became a legend in her own right, a ghost who appeared when bounty hunters came too close, a guardian who protected the Underground Railroad with methods no one spoke about openly. Whether any of this is true is impossible to verify. What is documented is that Nathaniel Clark died on October 27, 1854. That his death effectively ended a terror that had haunted the Ohio Valley for 6 years. That families who had lived in constant fear of his appearance could breathe slightly easier. And that the system he represented, the legal machinery of human hunting, continued operating with other men stepping into the role he had vacated. The iron collars found in that leather satchel were eventually donated to a historical society in Kentucky, where they remain in storage to this day, rarely displayed. Each collar bears its foundry mark and identification number. Museum records identify them as artifacts of the fugitive slave era, tools used by bounty hunters in the 1850s. What the records don't mention is that 43 people wore those collars during transports that tore them from families, from freedom, from lives they were building in the North. Some of those people can be identified through Clark's ledger, which survived despite his burning of Mitchell's notebook. The ledger is now held by the Kentucky Historical Society, available to researchers but rarely consulted. It lists 173 successful recoveries. Behind each entry was a person with a name, a history, a family. Behind each recovery was a community that lost a member, a church that lost a congregant, a network that failed to protect someone who had reached out for help. Nathaniel Clark terrorized escaped men and women across 7 states for 6 years. He made $14,300 doing it. He lived comfortably, invested wisely, died suddenly at age 37. His death changed very little. Other bounty hunters continued the work. The Fugitive Slave Act remained in force until 1864. The system he served survived him by over a decade. But in Philadelphia, in Cincinnati, in small black churches across the Ohio Valley, Clark's name became something else. A warning. A reminder that the system granted some people the power to destroy others with legal impunity. A story told to children to explain why vigilance mattered, why networks of protection were essential, why freedom was never secure as long as men like Clark could operate with federal authority. On certain October nights, some say, you can still find those collars at the Historical Society with rainwater collected in the grooves worn into the metal. A custodian once mentioned it to a researcher, how the artifacts seem to weep on the anniversary of Clark's death. Though of course it's just condensation from the climate-controlled storage. Just moisture finding the lowest points in corroded iron. Just physics, nothing more. But the people who survived Clark's hunts, and the descendants of those who didn't, know that some stains don't wash away. Some stories refuse to stay buried. Some terror lingers in courthouse records and oral histories, in iron collars stored in darkness, in the spaces between what's documented and what's remembered. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.